On a chilly night in March of 2012, a weary 56-year-old man with a patchy beard trudged through a backyard in rural Iowa with his coat pulled tight around him, dragging something very heavy behind him. He reached the fence and he paused, scanning the darkness to confirm that he was alone. His gaze fell on the trailer home on the opposite side of the fence. The lights were on, and he could hear the young couple inside arguing. The sound made his jaw clench. He turned around and looked at the thing he'd been dragging. Holding his breath and clenching a pack of zip ties in his teeth, he lifted it against the fence post. He worked quickly, using the zip ties to string it up, and once it was secure, he stepped back, shot a final look at the trailer, then turned and calmly walked home. But before we get into the story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please change the follow button's keyboard settings to another language so their typing makes no sense. Okay, let's get into today's story. On May 25th, 2012, 23-year-old Lisa Tekel, who was pregnant with her first child, sat in the passenger seat of her husband's beat-up pickup truck as he sped through the rural back roads of Agency, Iowa. Lisa and her husband Seth both had the morning off, and so they were running some errands around town. When the truck suddenly jolted over a pothole, Lisa Winston threw her hands over her belly. Seth apologized and promised to replace the shocks soon, but Lisa just rolled her eyes at him. She told him it wasn't the truck, it was Seth's driving, and she joked that if their baby was going to ride with them, they'd better invest in a top-notch car seat. Lisa was 17 weeks along with a baby girl, and already she and Seth had decided to name her Zoe Maria. Lisa had already begun saying the name out loud just to hear how it felt. As Lisa ticked off the things they still needed to buy, including a bassinet, diapers, and a stroller, Seth let out an anxious groan. Their baby wasn't even born and she was already costing a fortune, but Lisa reminded him that they would have the money soon. After all, Seth was about to start a new job in just a couple of weeks. The new job was thanks to Lisa's dad, who worked as a deputy at the local sheriff's office and had helped to get Seth a spot at the jail. Lisa was in the same line of work herself, already working as a corrections officer at a prison in the next county over. And while being a corrections officer was not exactly exciting or glamorous to either Lisa or Seth, it was steady and it gave both of them a real shot at eventually moving up to deputy positions down the line. And so, just thinking about the job reminded Lisa that Seth still had not thanked her father yet for getting him this job. And so Lisa dialed his number and sure enough, her dad, Todd Caldwell, picked up at the first ring. Lisa switched to speakerphone and then filled her ad in on the latest from the doctor. The baby was healthy and already fully formed with fingers, toes, and everything. She could hear the joy in her father's voice as he told them, for what had to be the 100th time, how excited he was to become a grandpapa. At some point, Seth chimed in to thank him for the job, but Todd brushed it off, saying Seth had earned it. And it was true. Even though Seth was only 21, he had already gotten an associate degree in criminal justice. He'd interned with the sheriff's office, and he was a volunteer firefighter. And so, slowly but surely, he was building the resume to become a full-blown cop. Seth thanked Todd for the vote of confidence, and Lisa began to say goodbye since they had just arrived at their next stop. But before she could hang up, Todd told them that there was actually something serious he wanted to speak to both of them about. He said that his office was getting frequent calls from Seth and Lisa's neighbor, Brian Tate, who kept complaining, without evidence, that Seth and Lisa were vandalizing his property. Todd told them that he didn't trust the guy and that they should really just try to stay clear of him. Lisa promised her dad that she and Seth would be careful. Then she told him that she loved him and ended the call to get out of the truck. Later that evening, after hours of errands and driving around, Seth and Lisa finally reached their home, which was a quiet trailer on a wooded plot just outside of town. They finished unloading the truck, then cuddled up in bed listening to their baby's heartbeat through a fetal Doppler monitor until they both fell asleep. At 5:00 a.m. the next morning, Seth was awakened by the sound of his alarm. He still had a few weeks of work left at his current job as a security guard, whereas Lisa was not working today. So Seth switched off the alarm quickly and then climbed out of bed, trying his best not to wake Lisa up. Lisa did stir a little bit, but rolled over onto her side and went back to sleep while Seth headed down the hall to take a shower and get ready for the day. 20 minutes later at 5:20 a.m., Deputy Martin Wonderland with the Wapello County Sheriff's Department was on patrol when a call cracked over the radio. There had been a shooting just outside the town of Agency, and when the dispatcher relayed the address and the caller's name, Wonderland's hands tightened on the wheel because he knew Seth Tekell. Wonderland worked with Seth's father-in-law, Todd. Wonderland flicked on his lights and floored it, tires kicking up dust as the cruiser or through the early morning stillness. When he arrived at the trailer, an ambulance was already waiting outside, which meant that a paramedic had beaten him down there. Otherwise, the property seemed perfectly peaceful until Wonderland rounded the side of the trailer and saw Seth on the back porch. Seth was barefoot, shirtless, and sobbing, but the only word that Wonderland could make out was Lisa. Wonderland realized that whoever the shooter was, they could still be nearby, so he ran back to his cruiser, popped open the trunk, pulled out his rifle, and then charged into the trailer. The living room was dark because the blinds were still drawn and everything looked untouched, with no obvious signs of forced entry. A rack of hunting rifles hung on the living room wall, and gleaming bowling trophies lined the shelf below. For a moment, Wonderland remembered Lisa's father Todd mentioning that his daughter had at one point been a state bowling champ in high school. Wonderland moved quietly down the hall, rifle raised, listening for any movement. He saw the bedroom door was open, so he stepped inside and then he stopped. The bedroom walls were splashed with blood. Lisa lay motionless in the bed. Her chest had been torn open by massive gunshot wounds. The paramedic who had beaten Wonderland to the scene crouched beside her, checking her for a pulse. He looked over at Wonderland and shook his head. Lisa was dead, along with her unborn child. There was a pistol out on the dresser just sitting there, but one look at it told Wonderland that it was far too small to cause this much damage. Wonderland backed out of the bedroom slowly and cleared the rest of the trailer one room at a time, making sure nobody else was there. Once he was sure it was empty, he returned to his cruiser and locked up his rifle in the trunk. Then he grabbed his radio, which he used to call dispatch, and he asked them to send backup, and he specified that they should notify Badge 58 right away. Badge 58 was Lisa's father, Todd. At that very moment, Todd was at home fast asleep. He was woken by the phone, and when he answered, he heard the familiar voice of the dispatcher and he thought it was just a work call. Then they told him that there had been a shooting and the victim was his daughter, Lisa. Within minutes, Todd was flying across town praying that there had been some kind of mix-up and that Lisa was okay. But when he reached her trailer, a small crowd of deputies were scattered across the yard. When they saw Todd, they immediately moved to block his path to the front door. The deputies felt like Wonderland had made a mistake calling him here because this was not something he needed to see. But the crowd didn't stop Todd. He pushed past his fellow officers into the trailer, and when he got to the bedroom, he took one look at his daughter and burst into tears. Todd stood in the doorway shaking with ragged sobs, but within moments, his grief became rage and he stormed back out of the trailer and he howled, "Go get him." And immediately, the deputies in the yard bolted to their cruisers and started pulling out body armor and slamming magazines into rifles. In seconds, they were geared up and moving in unison toward the house immediately next door to Seth and Lisa. This house belonged to Brian Tate, who was the neighbor that kept calling Todd's office to accuse Seth and Lisa of vandalizing his property. Brian was a 57-year-old Vietnam War veteran who was known to suffer from PTSD and schizophrenia. And so now, Todd was convinced that Brian must have had something to do with his daughter's death, not only because of those calls about vandalism, but also because of something that had happened between Seth, Lisa's husband, and Brian 2 months earlier. Late one night back in March, Seth had been making his way home through the dark streets when he suddenly jammed on the brakes to avoid hitting the deer lying in the middle of the road. Seth got out and inspected the animal and confirmed that it was already dead. Clearly someone else had hit the deer with their car and just left it there. Seth knew this deer carcass was actually pretty dangerous, and the last thing he wanted was for somebody else to come along here and either run over the deer and create a huge mess, or maybe swerve to avoid it like he had done but run off the road onto his property. So he dragged the deer carcass to the side of the road, right on the curb and onto what was technically the edge of Bryant 8's property. But in reality, the carcass was really basically out on the sidewalk. Then Seth got into his car and drove the very short distance to his home thinking that was the end of it, that he had done the right thing. But that wasn't the end of it. The next morning when Seth stepped outside, the deer had been moved from the sidewalk directly into his backyard. Seth realized that Brian must have woken up and found the carcass and been somehow mad about it and tossed it over the fence directly onto Seth's property. This was totally irritating in Seth's mind. The deer had been hit in front of Brian's place, so really it was Brian's responsibility to deal with it. So Seth grabbed the deer carcass again, which was now noticeably smellier as it was decomposing, and hurled it back over the fence back onto Brian's property. By the time Seth came home from work that evening, he found the deer carcass in his driveway. So what did he do? He picked it up again, dragged it over, and tossed it over the fence onto Brian's property. And then the next day, Seth found the carcass literally zip-tied to his fence post. The deer carcass went back and forth, growing more disgusting with each pass until it was almost falling apart. Eventually, some other animal must have dragged it off, but the feud continued. Brian began patrolling the fence at the edge of his property and would glare at Seth and Lisa whenever he saw them. He accused them of throwing rocks and beer cans at his garage, and when Seth and Lisa denied it, Brian stopped complaining to them and started calling the police instead to report them for vandalism. And then in April of 2012, so just 11 days before Lisa's murder, her father Todd had responded to one of those calls himself. He didn't tell Brian that he was Lisa's father or that he'd already heard all about the deer incident from Lisa. He wanted to genuinely hear Brian out and see what kind of person they were actually dealing with. Then Brian had not held back. He'd led Todd around his property, pointing out rocks he swore hadn't been there before while complaining that Seth and Lisa had committed what he called acts of terrorism against him. He even produced an old coffee can filled with dog feces that he said had been dumped on his porch and on the hood of his car. To Todd, Brian just seemed really paranoid, but as he continued ranting, Todd noticed something else. Just inside of Brian's front door, leaning casually against the wall, was clearly a shotgun. Seeing that gun made Todd nervous, so he tried to calm Brian down and assured him that Seth and Lisa were not out to get him here. He said that they were good people and would not do what he was saying they were doing. But Brian only grew more upset. Eventually, Brian just stalked off away from Todd and went inside his house, slamming the door, and that was the end of the conversation. And so, from that moment on, Todd had been convinced that Brian Tate was unstable and dangerous. He had warned his daughter and Seth to steer clear, and he made sure every deputy on the force knew that if they ever got another call involving Brian Tate, they should go in expecting Brian to be the threat. So on the morning of Lisa's murder, when four deputies charged up Brian Tate's driveway, they half expected him to come out shooting. But when they knocked, Brian answered the door completely unarmed and he seemed perfectly calm. He scratched at his beard, looking around at the deputies through puffy eyes, and then asked them what was going on. The deputies traded nervous glances. They didn't want to give away their suspicions just yet, so they told Brian that unfortunately his neighbor Lisa had been found dead and that now they were making their rounds to see if anybody had heard or seen anything unusual. Brian stared at them for a long beat, then told the deputies to wait right there. He disappeared back inside his house, then returned with a stack of plastic lawn chairs which he set out on the lawn. And to the deputies' surprise, for the next 40 minutes, Brian fielded all their questions about everything from his whereabouts that morning to his mental state and his relationship with Seth and Lisa. He told them that he didn't know anything about what happened to Lisa and certainly hadn't heard any gunshots that morning because, actually, he'd been deeply asleep, sleeping off the effects of the new antipsychotic meds his doctor had him on. The deputies weren't quite sure what to make of him. Brian was surprisingly open, not defensive or jittery, but he also wasn't acting even remotely shocked by the news of Lisa's death. And some of what he said raised serious red flags. For one thing, he kept saying that none of this would have happened if the police had just taken his calls seriously, which, of course, really made him look quite suspicious because his calls were complaints about Seth and Lisa. And then, once he brought up the vandalism, it was like no matter what the deputies asked, Brian would steer the conversation back to the vandalism. He said that before his feud with Seth and Lisa, he'd been Mr. Raw. Nice guy, people had taken advantage of him. Now, he said he was, quote, kind of taking a different approach to life right now, being more serious and more not such a nice guy. Meanwhile, back at Seth and Lisa's trailer home, an evidence retrieval crew had arrived and was busy sweeping the area. Seth was despondent in the driveway, sobbing and punching his oak ruck until his knuckles bled, while Todd tried his best to calm him down. When one of the deputies swung by to say that Seth had been scheduled for an interview at the sheriff's station, nobody was surprised. Todd and Seth both understood that as Lisa's husband, Seth had to be looked at seriously as a suspect, and so Seth had no issue doing the interview and said he was just eager to get it over with. Once Seth sat down inside of the tiny interview room, he half expected to actually recognize whoever it was that came in to speak to him. After all, he was pretty well connected in town and certainly had a connection to law enforcement. However, the man who walked into the interview room was somebody Seth didn't know. He was clean-shaven and wearing a crisp suit. The man introduced himself as Detective Chris Thomason, said that he was an investigator with the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigation, and he'd been sent to assist with this case. Suddenly, Seth wondered if maybe he'd made a mistake coming here without a lawyer, but Detective Thomas assured him he just needed Seth to walk him through what happened that morning. That was it. So Seth began telling the story, struggling to keep his voice level as he described waking up at 5 a.m. to get ready for work, and how he'd just gotten into the shower when he heard what sounded like a gunshot. Seth said he had jumped out of the shower right away. He had saw the front door open and ran to the bedroom where Lisa was, and he had found her still in bed, but she was moaning. Then, he heard a loud thump from the back deck and realized there had to be an intruder, so he grabbed his pistol from the nightstand and raced after them. Seth told Detective Thomas that he fully intended to shoot whoever the intruder was, but when he got to the porch, they were already gone. So he ran back inside to the bedroom and discovered that Lisa was not breathing, and that's when he saw his wife's gunshot wound and realized, clearly, she had been shot. He called 911, but by the time the paramedics arrived, she was already dead. As Seth finished the story, emotion overwhelmed him and he broke down, but Thomas didn't offer any comfort. Instead, he began pressing Seth about his marriage and asked if Seth and Lisa had been fighting, or if they were having money problems or extramarital affairs. Without hesitation, Seth looked up and said no, there is nothing like that. But just then, the detective's phone buzzed with an incoming text message, and when the detective glanced down at it, Seth felt a flash of panic as he wondered if maybe the text might be about him. The real reason Seth was nervous, though, is because he knew he had not been 100% honest with this detective. He did have a secret, and he knew that if it came out, it would make him look guilty and also be very embarrassing for Lisa's family. But now he realized that keeping that secret was not going to help his situation, so he decided he would split the difference. He would tell Detective Thomas some truth, the most relevant information, if you will, but he would hold back the details that would offend Lisa's father and, frankly, embarrass the whole family. And so, before the detective could move on to any other subject, Seth said, "Hold on a minute. There was another woman, at least sort of." For the past few months, Seth said he'd been texting with a co-worker named Rachel. They'd hung out a few times after work and had even kissed a handful of times, but that was as far as it had gone. Seth had realized it was wrong and had ended things with Rachel before it turned into a full-blown affair. But Seth had barely even finished the story when Detective Thomas actually stopped him and said he knew that Seth was actually still lying. And that's when Thomas revealed that he had been receiving text messages from another team of officers who were questioning Seth's friends, and that through them, Thomas had learned that Seth kept a secret burner phone. Seth had not just been flirting with Rachel, they'd also been sending each other sexually suggestive photos as well. Seth was stunned, one, that his instinct that those text messages the detective was getting were somehow tied to him, that actually was correct. And two, he hadn't realized how quickly the people around him would talk about him. So now he realized that those minor embarrassing details he'd hoped to keep hidden were going to make him look that much guiltier. So he changed his story for the second time and admitted that he had held back information because he was scared of what Lisa's father, Todd, would do if he found out about the sexting. Seth still insisted that he and Rachel had never actually slept together, but he did admit that yes, there had been racy photos exchanged and also he had not ended things with Rachel. And yes, Rachel believed Seth was going to leave Lisa to be with her. In fact, Seth admitted that he had told Rachel that Lisa was going to be packing her bags and leaving that very day. The moment the words were out of his mouth, Seth knew how bad it sounded, but by this point, he knew he really didn't have another choice. He had to say what he just said. However, he could see from Detective Thomas's face that damage had been done here, Ran. Clearly, he'd messed up by not telling them about the secret phone from the start, and now nothing he said would sound like the truth. Meanwhile, across town, Lisa's father, Todd, still had complete faith in Seth. Todd was home grieving with Lisa's stepmom and sisters when the phone rang. It was Deputy Wonderland calling with an update on Lisa's case. Wonderland started out by telling Todd that Brian Tate, the neighbor, had not been arrested yet, which to Todd was a huge, infuriating surprise. He'd been sure that by this point, they would have Brian in cuffs at the station. But before Todd could say anything, Wonderland dropped even worse news. He told Todd that state investigators had taken the reins on the case, and they didn't think Brian was guilty. Instead, they were laser-focused on Seth. When Todd heard that, he did not want to believe it. He trusted Seth like his own son, whereas Brian Tate had always seemed like a ticking time bomb. And he was horrified by the thought that an outside agency was going to come in, misjudge the whole situation, and ruin Seth's life while letting Brian walk away scot-free. But even as he was thinking that, the cop and Todd said to set his emotions aside and just let the investigation play out. In cases like this one, the husband was typically the one who did it, and as much as Todd wanted to believe this was different, he wasn't naive. And he also had complete faith in the police force. He knew that if the detectives did their job, then Brian would be exposed eventually. So he promised Wonderland that he would keep his distance from Seth for the moment and not try to interfere with the case. The truth would come out soon enough. In the days that followed, as Todd made arrangements for his daughter's funeral, he stayed in close contact with the investigation. Deputies had gone back to Brian Tate's property to ask more questions and look for evidence, but so far nothing had come of it. As for Tate himself, he continued to be cooperative, letting them inside, showing them his extensive gun collection, and answering their questions without hesitation. As for the crime scene, there really wasn't much evidence there either, as Todd would learn from his colleagues. There were no signs of a break-in at Seth and Lisa's trailer, no strange fingerprints in the bedroom. Lisa's autopsy revealed that her killer was likely standing at the foot of the bed when they shot her, but the gun was still missing. There was only one potentially interesting piece of evidence found at the scene. Half of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich inside of a Ziploc bag had been discovered on the back porch, near the steps leading toward the woods surrounding Seth and Lisa's property. When Todd heard about the sandwich, he really doubted that it was relevant. In his estimation, Seth or Lisa had probably dropped it the day before the murder, so the fact that the investigators were focusing on it showed just how little they had to go on. But then he got word of a new discovery that immediately put the sandwich out of his mind and looked really bad for Seth. The morning after the killing, a Mossberg shotgun was discovered in the tall grass outside of Seth and Lisa's trailer. It had been sent to the lab, and testing confirmed it was a match for the deer slug that ultimately killed Lisa. Now, the shotgun was not Seth's, but it was registered to one of Seth's friends, who told detectives he had left it with Seth for safekeeping. When Todd heard this, he tried to find an explanation, some reason why Seth would have forgotten or overlooked something that important. But nothing added up, because if this was a break-in, if someone else had come into the house to kill Lisa, why wouldn't they bring their own weapon? But Todd couldn't think of an answer, and so, for the first time since his daughter's death, he actually considered the possibility that maybe he'd gotten this whole thing wrong. Maybe Brian really was innocent and Seth was Lisa's killer. While all this was happening, Seth had been lying low at his parents' house, but for days after the murder, he headed to the funeral home for Lisa's visitation. Lisa's entire family was there, keeping to the opposite side of the room from where Seth was sitting. It was the first time that Seth and Todd had been in the same space since the morning of the murder, and the shift in mood was unmistakable. Todd would not speak to Seth at all, but Seth noticed he kept glancing in his direction, almost like he couldn't help himself. Seth had already been feeling isolated, but this really cut deeper. Lisa's family had always treated him like one of their own, and now they weren't even meeting his eyes. He stood to the side, unsure of what to do, until he spotted Lisa's little sister. Out of all of Lisa's family members, Seth had been closest to her, so after nervously glancing at her a few times, he got up the courage to cross the aisle and approach her directly. He didn't know how she was going to react, but he was so desperate for a connection that he just walked over, gave her a hug, and then whispered that he loved her and that she would always be his little sister. And when Lisa's little sister said she loved him too, Seth's hope bloomed. He told himself that maybe the cold shoulder he was feeling was just grief and confusion, and that maybe Lisa's family had not given up on him completely. But as the visitation ended and Seth walked out of the funeral home, a county police cruiser was waiting for him. Deputy Wonderland approached him, told Seth to turn around, and put his hands behind his back. He was being charged with Lisa's murder. Seth didn't resist. He let Wonderland cuff him and lead him to the car, then just stared out the window as they pulled away from the funeral home. Lisa's family stared right back at him, and in their cold expressions, he could see their doubts hardening. The last thread had snapped. His friends, Lisa's family, the cops he'd once hoped to work alongside, none of them believed him anymore. Seth was alone. But while the state swiftly moved toward a trial against Seth, the media was not ready to let Brian Tate go as a suspect. Local journalists spaded Brian as the unhinged neighbor with a stockpile of guns and a history of paranoia. Whenever Lisa's father Todd would read one of those stories about Brian, he found himself growing more upset about the case. At the start, he'd been sure Brian was his daughter's killer, but learning about the shotgun in the grass and also Seth's text message affair had really changed his mind. Now reporters were digging up as much dirt as they could on Brian, but instead of Todd buying into them, he found himself feeling something he hadn't expected: sympathy. After all, Todd had really been the one to flag Brian early on as being unstable and potentially dangerous, and he couldn't help but feel partly responsible for the way the media was now portraying him. And these feelings of guilt only deepened when Todd learned that Brian had been involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility. The details weren't public, but from what Todd heard, it seemed like the press attention had pushed an already fragile man past his breaking point. And then on September 30th, when Brian was no longer in the psychiatric facility, he was found dead inside of his home. The autopsy ruled it was natural causes, some kind of sudden cardiac failure, but his elderly mother would tell reporters he had died of a broken heart, that the stress from the media coverage around the case had just destroyed him. And Todd agreed with her. He decided that Brian Tate had become the third victim. He was collateral damage in Seth's murder of Lisa and her unborn daughter. Now Todd just wanted the trial to start. It finally did on February 18th, 2013, almost a year after Lisa's murder. And just as Todd expected, Seth's lawyers made Brian Tate the centerpiece of their defense. But what Todd did not see coming was how much new evidence the defense had uncovered, like the fact that just a few days before Lisa's murder, Brian's mother told a neighbor that Brian had stopped taking his medication. This was a major red flag, both because it raised the question of what mental state Brian was in on the day of the murder and because it seemed to go directly against what Brian had told police, that he didn't hear any gunshots that morning because he was so tired and passed out from sleeping off his medication. If that story was a lie, then it suddenly became a lot easier to envision Brian breaking into Seth and Lisa's trailer in the early morning hours, grabbing a shotgun off the wall and murdering Lisa in cold blood. But the defense did not just focus on Brian. They argued that the police investigation itself had been sloppy from the start and pointed out everything from procedural mistakes to leads that had been completely ignored. Most importantly, neither Seth nor Brian Tate had been tested for gunshot residue, which should have been the typical procedure for this kind of shooting. No one had checked the spent shotgun shells for fingerprints either, which could have easily revealed the killer's identity. Then there was the mystery of the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which still hadn't been solved. The investigators had written it off as unrelated to the case, but the defense pointed out that there was a major problem with that line of thinking. Seth and Lisa lived in a wooded area with all kinds of wildlife nearby. If that sandwich had been sitting out overnight, it likely would have been torn apart by animals by dawn. But it wasn't, which suggested it had not been there for very long. If it was dropped that morning before the police arrived, it could have only been left by Lisa's killer. Now, the sandwich itself didn't prove anyone's guilt or innocence, but the defense presented it as emblematic of all the questions that the police could not answer. It looked like the investigators just hadn't bothered to tie up loose ends because they made up their minds that Seth was guilty, even though there were no eyewitnesses and no DNA evidence tying him to the murder. Hearing the confusing back and forth, Todd couldn't help but worry that the justice system that both he and his daughter fervently believed in would not give him the answers he so desperately needed. As for Seth, he sat through the debate, listening to all the talk of sandwiches, gunshot residue, and Bryant Bates' mental health, feeling the walls close in on him. Lisa's family was glaring at him, clearly trying to get a reaction. His friends had cut off all contact with him, and the town where he grew up viewed him as a killer. And so now, his fate rested with 12 strangers. As the jury deliberated, Seth braced for the worst. But when the verdict came back, it wasn't a verdict at all. One juror was holding out, refusing to convict. For Seth, this was like a gift from the heavens. One person in the world had looked at all the evidence and believed him. So the judge declared a mistrial. And then, a few months later, they were back in court. The second trial mirrored the first with the same arguments and same witnesses, but this time, the numbers shifted. Now 3 jurors instead of just one wanted to acquit, so the second trial ended with another hung jury. Seth felt like things had to be improving for him, but his lawyers knew how close they'd come to losing. So they decided to go back to the evidence in hopes there was something they'd missed. And sure enough, they struck on something massive. Seth's lawyers discovered that in October of 2011, months before Seth and Lisa's wedding, Lisa had carried out a brief sexual relationship with a coworker named Jason. She and Jason, who was married himself, had even discussed the possibility that he might be the father of her baby. This new information gave Jason a powerful motive to want to keep his affair secret from his own wife. And just as important, this new information showed once again that the police had screwed up. They must have seen text messages on Lisa's phone that hinted at the affair, and so their failure to properly investigate the lead was just more proof that they had been gunning for Seth from the start and had failed to consider other possible suspects. During the third trial, Lisa's family was forced to sit and listen as Lisa's most shameful secrets were exposed in front of everyone. It was especially devastating for her father Todd, since he'd always been close to Lisa and thought she told him everything. But not this. But the third trial wasn't over yet, and soon one more witness was called to the stand. The court was silent as this witness took the stand and got sworn in, and as they did, the witness glanced around nervously the whole time. And from the moment the witness actually started speaking, Todd realized he finally knew beyond a reasonable doubt who actually killed his daughter. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Lisa Tekel on the morning of May 26, 2012. At 5:00 a.m. that morning, before the first rays of dawn began spilling over the trees, the killer stood outside of Seth and Lisa's trailer. They paced back and forth in the fading darkness, a cigarette trembling between their fingers. They knew they could not let this go any longer. Something had to change now. So finally making up their mind, they tossed the cigarette, climbed the steps to the trailer, and slipped inside. The killer moved through the living room, eyes adjusting to the dim interior area. The shotgun was right there on the rack. They took it down, loaded it with slow, deliberate movements, and then crept toward the bedroom where Lisa lay sleeping. The killer hesitated, reminding themselves that it was not too late to stop. They could put the gun back and walk away. Instead, they raised the shotgun and pulled the trigger. As the sound rang in their ears, the killer bolted, terrified that someone had heard. They ran down the hallway, out the back door, across the porch, and into the woods behind the trailer. Breathing hard, they reached the tree line where they found a patch of tall grass and ditched the gun there. For a moment, They just stood there doing their best to try to compose themselves. Then, at some point, they turned around, took a deep breath, and walked calmly back through the woods, climbed the porch steps, took out their phone, and dialed 911. The killer did not worry for a moment that they were actually going to get caught, because they knew exactly who to blame for the murder. If everything went as planned, the police would take the bait and never guess the truth. And it might have worked, except for one witness who came forward during Seth's third trial. The witness whose explosive testimony finally cleared away all doubts was one of Seth's friends, who admitted to vandalizing Brian Tate's property on Seth's orders. They dumped buckets of dog feces directly onto Brian's porch and also smeared them across the hood of his car. It turned out that Seth had goaded Brian into a feud that made him look crazy and dangerous. And so when Lisa wound up murdered, Seth knew that everyone would assume Brian was the killer. Because Seth killed Lisa, he did it because he wanted to be with Rachel, and because in the days leading up to the murder, Rachel had begun pulling away. And so Seth decided to murder Lisa, both so that he could be free to be with Rachel and so that he wouldn't have to start his new life owing child support. During the third trial, the jury was as convinced as Lisa's father Todd was, and on Wednesday, July 24th, 2014, they delivered a unanimous verdict. Seth was found guilty of first-degree murder and non-consensual termination of a human pregnancy, and he received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Some people will lie, cheat, and steal to get ahead. But today's podcast features two wild stories where those so-called master plans fall apart in the most unexpected ways. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Sign Here, and it's about a seemingly routine trip to the bank that quickly becomes very disturbing. And the second and final story you'll hear is called A Carefully Laid Plan, and it's about an undercover cop who witnesses something in a fast food restaurant that cracks his case wide open. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, on the next very hot day, take the Amazon Music follow button out to a public park, and as soon as they need to use the bathroom, point them in the direction of a porta-john, and then when they go inside of it, immediately wrap it up in saran wrap and push it over. Okay, let's get into our first story called Sign Hero. On April 16th, 2024, a 42-year-old woman named Darica Nunes and her 68-year-old uncle named Paulo Braga arrived at a bank in the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro in a cab app. Erica got out of the backseat first and then asked the driver to wait so she could go inside the bank to get a wheelchair for her uncle, because recently he had been sick with pneumonia in the hospital. She found one in the lobby and then wheeled it back outside. When she got back to the cab, the driver helped her lift her uncle Paulo into the wheelchair, and then afterward, Erica thanked the driver and then she wheeled her uncle up to the bank. And as she got near the door, our bank attendant came out and opened up the door for them to go inside. Erica smiled at the attendant. Her uncle had been living with her for the past 8 months, and so Erica was pretty accustomed to some level of caretaking. But it had gotten a lot harder recently with her uncle being in the hospital with pneumonia, and so Erica was just exhausted. And so, little gestures like this were very appreciated. But despite her exhaustion, today was a really good day for Erica, because her uncle was so appreciative for all the help that he had actually offered to go to this bank with her today and take out a loan for her in his name, so she could do some much-needed repairs around her house. So Erica and her uncle made their way through the bank towards the front desk and then told the attendant that they needed to see a loan officer. She explained that they had already called ahead and her uncle had been approved for a loan. He was just here now to sign the paperwork. The attendant nodded and then typed a few things on their computer, and then came out from behind the desk and led Erica and her uncle to a desk and back to wait for the loan officer. A minute later, when Erica saw the loan officer approaching the desk, she stood up and smiled and was about to say hello, but the loan officer did not smile back. Instead, she just glared at Erica and her uncle in a way that made Erica feel very uncomfortable. And then instead of shaking their hands, the the lone officer just turned around and walked away. Erica looked around in confusion and then sort of sat down awkwardly, feeling worried and also a little annoyed. She turned and watched as this lone officer continued walking away and then stopped next to some employee. She bent down and whispered something in the employee's ear, and Erica watched as this employee's eyes went wide as she heard whatever the lone officer said. And then this lone officer and that employee, they got up and they vanished into a back room of the bank. So now Erica was feeling really weird about all of this. She turned to her uncle and she saw he couldn't even meet her eyes. So she reached out and just began massaging his neck and shoulders. A little while later, the lone officer would come back to the desk, and this time she was carrying this huge stack of papers, and she placed it on the desk in front of Erica's uncle. But instead of sitting down and going over this huge amount of paperwork with them, the lone officer just stood there staring at Erica. And Erica stared right back. And for about 30 seconds, there was just tense silence. And then eventually, the lone officer pulled out her phone and very obviously started filming. And so, now Erica went from feeling just uncomfortable to feeling sort of afraid. I mean, this was definitely not normal bank behavior, even for a seemingly very rude employee. But Erica decided to kind of ignore the weirdness and just get her uncle started on the paperwork. But after a few minutes, Erica began to hear the sound of emergency sirens outside the bank, and when she looked up, she saw all these police and first responders running towards her. The video that lone officer shot that day of Erica and her uncle went viral in Brazil. In this video, Erica is seen smiling and attempting to help her uncle sign this paperwork, and she's obviously holding up her uncle's head. But her uncle is not weak from illness. Her uncle is dead. In fact, he had died hours before Erica had brought him to the bank. Now Erica later claimed that she had no idea her uncle was dead. However, it was very obvious to everyone around her, which is why all the bank employees were acting so strange. Erica was arrested and held for 16 days before being released on bail. She faces charges of abusing a corpse and attempted theft through fraud. Her case has not yet been adjudicated. The next and final story of today's episode is called A Carefully Laid Plan. On the evening of June 17, 2004, a 21-year-old woman named Molly Daniels pulled into the driveway of her little home that she shared with her husband and 2 kids in suburban Texas. It had been a long day for Molly at the home remodeling business where she worked as a receptionist, and so now that she was home, the last thing she wanted to do was go inside and make dinner for her family. And so after turning off her car, Molly just sat there in the driveway for a couple of minutes, just zoned out, looking out the window. But eventually, she kind of snapped out of it. She gathered up her things, she got out of the car, and she made her way up to the front door. And as soon as she stepped into her home, that bad mood she was feeling from work was wiped away and replaced with happiness. Because the first thing she heard the second she was in her home was the sound of her 4-year-old son Caleb hysterically laughing. And so Molly walked into the back room and she found her son, along with her husband Clay, rolling around on the ground, tickling each other, and next to them was their 1-year-old daughter, sitting on the rug, laughing as well and clapping and watching along. And so as soon as Molly walked into the room, Clay, who was underneath Caleb, stopped for a second and grinned up at Molly. Molly smiled back, and then Clay and Caleb went back to wrestling, and the 1-year-old continued to laugh and play along. And so Molly suddenly felt so content with her life. It was so incredible to have a family of her own. And so with a big smile on her face now, she headed off into the kitchen to make dinner. Life had been tough financially for the Daniels family recently. The city where they lived, called Leander, was located just north of Austin, Texas, and it was getting more and more expensive every single year. Clay, who was 2 years older than Molly, he was 23, he was a mechanic, but he had been out of work for months, and so he had just been staying home with the kids. As for Molly, she had her job as a receptionist, but it paid very little, and so, ultimately, the family was just barely scraping by. But despite the financial hardship they were under, Molly was so thankful that she had a husband in Clay that was so good with their kids, especially Caleb, the 4-year-old son. because Caleb was actually Molly's son from a previous relationship, and she was worried that maybe Clay wouldn't necessarily treat him like his own. But Clay had totally stepped up to the plate and become Caleb's father, and Caleb definitely viewed Clay as his dad. And so that relationship was as close as if they were biologically related, and so Molly just felt so grateful for that. That evening, the family sat down and had dinner together, and then, afterwards, Molly and Clay got the kids off to bed, and then Molly and Clay stayed up and watched TV together. But after a while, Molly said she was tired and she was going to go to bed. Clay said he'd be staying up for a bit longer, and so the couple kissed, said goodnight, and Molly made her way upstairs. At around 10:45 p.m. that night, so about 15 minutes after Molly went upstairs, she was laying in bed drifting off to sleep when she heard the sound of their front door opening, then shut, and then she heard the sound of their car being turned on leaving the driveway. Now, this was not a big deal for Molly because earlier that night, Clay had mentioned kind of offhandedly that he wanted to go see his mom that night, that he might swing over there and say hello. He had a couple of paperback books that he wanted to give her, and so Molly knew there was a chance he could be doing that, and so she assumed that had to be what she was hearing. And so she forgot about it and fell asleep. The next morning, when Molly woke up at 6, Aja rolled over and she saw Clay was not in bed with her. Now, she wasn't immediately alarmed by this, because it wasn't unusual for Clay to get up really early. And so Molly climbed out of bed. She made her way over to the window, and she looked down at the driveway, expecting to see their car back, meaning Clay would be downstairs somewhere. But she looked in the driveway, there was no car. And so suddenly feeling kind of panicked, Molly went downstairs and looked around the house. Clay wasn't there, and so she picked up the phone and she called Clay's mother. And when Clay's mother picked up, Molly said, "Hey, is Clay with you? He said he was stopping by last night. I heard him leave. Is he with you?" And Clay's mother would say, "No, he's not here at all. And in fact, I didn't even know he was going to be stopping by last night. I haven't heard from him." The drive from Molly and Clay's house to Clay's mother's house was 40 miles of twisting, fairly dangerous highway. Now, Clay regularly made this trip to and from his mother's house, and so Molly was never that worried about him going on this 40-mile stretch. But suddenly, without saying it, both Molly and Clay's mother were thinking the same thing. Did Clay get into a car accident last night on the drive to his mother's house? And so at some point, Clay's mom on the phone tells Molly to stay calm. Stay at the house with your kids. I'm going to get in the car, I'm going to drive the route that Clay would have taken back to you, and we'll see if we can find him. And then as soon as the two women hung up, Clay's mother ran to her car. She jumped inside, she turned it on, she peeled out of the driveway, and began speeding those 40 miles back towards Clay and Molly's house. And she had only gotten about halfway along this trip when up ahead, she saw all these flashing blue and white lights. She saw crime scene tape across the whole road. This was a section of the highway that was heavily forested on either side. And she could see traffic was backed up very far on the other end and as well on her side. And so of course Clay's mother is thinking, this is my son. He's been in an accident right here. And so she pulls over to the side of the road, she throws it in park, she gets out and runs to the nearest police officer, and begins frantically asking them, what's happened here, Raul? What's happened? And as she's talking to the officer, she notices behind him, there's all this smoke coming up from the forest. There's a fire down in the forest. And so she's craning her neck to look down and see what it is, and the officer tried to stop her, but finally she pushed past him, and she looked and she saw there was a car on fire that clearly had flown off the road. And so in a total panic, she begins asking the officer, do you know who it is? Is it my son? Is it Clay? The officer told her to please calm down. We have no idea whose car this is. We're trying to figure it out. The fire department hasn't even put the fire out yet. We don't know enough to tell you anything. But at this point, Clay's mother could not wait any longer for answers, and so she turned around, she ran back to her car, she hopped in it, and she made her way around this big police barricade and sped the rest of the way to Clay and Molly's house. And there she picked up Molly, she drove her back, and when they got there, Both women are totally hysterical. But they run right up to the police station. They look down in the direction of where this fire had been, which now had been put out. There was just smoke coming off of this car frame that had been totally burned out. Then immediately when Molly looked down there, she recognized the car, or I should say she recognized the shape of the car, because the fire had totally eviscerated the car. But Molly, she was seeing the frame was about the right size, and she was seeing that strewn around this burned out car were all these paperback books that had been burned up partially in this fire. And she knew that Clay had likely been on his way to his mother's house with all these paperback books inside of the vehicle. And so she knew this had to be Clay. And at the same time that Molly is having this horrible realization, the fire department down below was able to actually get into the burned out vehicle. They opened up the door and they found right away there was a body in the driver's seat. And so between the size of the body, all the paperback books that Molly said, that would be something Clay would have. Along with several other personal effects that were found inside of the car, like Clay's prized Harley-Davidson pin that he always wore in his hat. It was obvious that this was Clay. When word spread about Clay's death, Molly's neighbors and friends and Leander jumped into action. People loved Molly and Leander. She was this very sweet, very kind woman who was a little bit socially awkward, but they had found ever since she had married Clay, she had really found some more confidence and just seemed happier. And so, it was totally devastating to see Clay be pulled from her life like that. And so very quickly, the community in Leander raised $1,000 and they gave it to Molly and her kids. And then, also neighbors began dropping off food and stocking their fridge with groceries. And even though Molly couldn't even eat, she was so grief-stricken from the loss of Clay. She still very much appreciated the effort that people were making that people were comfort her. But as the community rallied around Molly and her kids to get them through this difficult time, the police were starting to ask some questions about how exactly this crash that had killed Clay actually happened. Because there were some oddities about the scene of the accident. The biggest being there were no skid marks on the road, which meant Clay had not hit the brakes before swerving off the road and crashing down in the trees below. And secondly, they didn't really understand how the fire that had started after this crash had gotten so incredibly hot that it basically had completely melted away every part of the vehicle, save for the frame. And also Clay's body had been totally destroyed. I mean, the authorities had seen fires after car accidents, but nothing like this. This looked very unique. And so investigators started to wonder if they were really dealing with a car accident or if this was a murder. And on June 22nd, just 4 days after Clay was found, investigators would learn from a crime lab that their suspicions had been correct. It would turn out there was lighter fluid found all over the front seat of the car, so that was the reason the fire had gotten so big. And then during the autopsy, Clay's lungs showed that he had not ever inhaled any soot, meaning he was dead when the fire started. And so, very likely, Clay was murdered and the car accident was staged. When word started to get out in town that Clay's death seemed suspicious and that maybe he was murdered, it turned out nobody was surprised. Because even though Molly adored Clay and thought he was a great father, most other people in Leander hated him. He was known around town to be this totally short-tempered guy who would just pick fights with people out of the blue. In fact, at Clay's own funeral, his literal best friend stood up to eulogize him, and during this he said, "I think honestly, the world is a better place without Clay." And so investigators began looking into Clay's background to see if they could find connections with people that might have a grudge or some reason to be mad at Clay, who might want to do him harm. And very quickly, investigators found something. Just 10 days before Clay was found, he had pleaded guilty to sexually assaulting a 7-year-old girl. But the sentence he received was incredibly light. He was given 30 days in jail, which he had not served yet, and probation. Now the father of the victim, the 7-year-old girl, was absolutely furious about Clay's light sentence. And in fact, just a couple of days before Clay died, the father threatened to kill Clay. So investigators quickly tracked down this father and they brought him in for questioning. But very quickly, this father made it clear to police that yes, he hated Clay. Yes, he had threatened to kill Clay. But no, he had nothing to do with what happened to Clay. And the father had an alibi to back that up. And so after confirming his alibi, the police somewhat reluctantly allowed the father to leave, even though to a lot of them, he just really seemed like the slam dunk primary suspect. But he couldn't have been. And so with him out of the picture, the police were kind of back to the drawing board. And so they decided they would actually go talk to Molly and see if maybe she could shed some light on who else might have wanted to hurt Clay. Now, in their previous conversations with Molly, police found her to be incredibly polite and also, at the same time, very upset about the death of her husband. But this time, when investigators showed up at Molly's house and she brought them into her kitchen where they sat down to talk, it was like the police got a totally different Molly. And it happened as soon as they asked her, hey, who do you think could have hurt your husband? It was like Molly suddenly became impatient. She didn't have time for these questions. And finally she just said, you know what? I think Clay was depressed because he had that prison sentence that was coming up that he didn't want to serve, and so probably he just killed himself. I think that's what happened. And so now I need you guys to leave. And so the officers didn't make a fuss. They didn't fight Molly on this. They just got up. They left. But once they were back out in their car, they looked at each other and they both agreed that Molly's behavior was very suspicious. And it made them think, maybe she actually knows more about what happened to Clay and she's kind of trying to cover it up and make the police go away. And over the next couple of weeks, as police began investigating Molly, they discovered quite a bit of evidence that made them even more suspicious of her. For one thing, there was Clay's $110,000 life insurance policy that Molly was entitled to. And Molly had apparently been calling the insurance company nearly nonstop every day, trying to get them to wire that payment as soon as possible. And Molly apparently was telling people in town how excited she was about getting that money. Also, police learned it after talking to Molly's neighbors that Molly was starting to date again already. Just 3 weeks after her husband has died, she's out there on the dating scene, even bringing home one of her boyfriends and having him live with her to kids. And according to Molly's babysitter, this new boyfriend that was coming into the house was really upsetting Caleb, the 4-year-old who had been so close with Clay. The babysitter would say that Caleb, who normally was a very mellow child back when Clay was still alive, was now very violent and emotional. And periodically he would just stop, look up into the sky, and scream, "I love you, Daddy." But when the babysitter brought this up to Molly and said, "Really, you should get your son some help here," Molly got angry and said Caleb was fine. It was none of her business, and then she slammed the door on the babysitter. But despite how suspicious Molly now seemed, there wasn't any real evidence that actually linked her to Clay's death. And so finally, in the fall of 2004, so several months after Clay's death, and still the police have not figured out who killed him, or how he died, and how he wound up in this inferno by the side of the road, they decided to kind of reinvigorate this investigation into Molly. They really wanted to find evidence that she was involved in Clay's death, and so they decided to put a surveillance team on Molly 24/7. And at first, the undercover police would report that Molly's behavior was incredibly routine. She basically did the same things every single day. She got up, she got the kids out the door, she went to work. Afterwards, she picked her kids up from the babysitter, she went home, she fed her kids, and then they all went to bed. And they did it all again the next day. The only deviation from her schedule was periodically she would go out after work to run some errands, like go to the grocery store. But then, on December 3rd, so 6 months after Clay was found, Molly would finally break her routine. On that day, Molly, on her way home from work, made a pit stop in this parking lot near several local stores. So she parked her car, she got out, but then instead of walking into one of these stores to run an errand or something, she walked to a dark-colored Mustang that was parked in the parking lot as well, and a guy was driving it. This guy the cop didn't recognize with dark hair. Molly walked up to him and began talking to this guy through the window, and then at some point Molly began very suspiciously looking over her shoulder, like she was trying to see if anyone was watching her. And then she walked around and climbed into the Mustang with this guy. She shut the door, and then the two of them drove off together. And so, the undercover police officer followed after them, and eventually the Mustang containing Molly and this guy pulled into the parking lot of a Taco Bell, a fast food restaurant. And so they stopped, they got out, and the undercover officer watched as the two of them casually walked inside of the Taco Bell. They ordered some food and they sat down by the window to eat. And so by this point, the undercover officer, he's not seen anything incriminating happening here. But what he's seeing is such a break from her routine that it just seemed really suspicious and he wanted to go inside and have a look. And so, he called for backup from another undercover officer who was part of the surveillance team. He came into the parking lot and then the two of them, these two officers who are wearing plain civilian clothes, they both got out of their unmarked vehicles and they casually walked into the Taco Bell and they got in line to order food. And as they were standing in line, one of the undercover officers casually turned around in line and very nonchalantly scanned the room, like he was looking at nothing in particular. But in reality, what he was doing was taking a quick glimpse at Molly and this guy she was with. And when the officer took this quick glimpse, he noticed something very strange about the guy that Molly was sitting with. Something that the officer hadn't seen before, but now that he was up close, he could see it. And as soon as he saw this strange thing, the officer tapped on his partner's shoulder like, "All right, we're doing something here." The officer reached down, put his hand on his concealed gun underneath his shirt, and then he walked across the restaurant, not even pretending to be undercover at this point. He's basically giving away that he's a cop. He strode right over to their table, and when he stopped in front of them, Molly and the guy she was with both looked up at him in surprise. And the officer just stared down at the guy, not at Molly, just at the guy. The strange thing the officer had caught when he looked over at the guy was that he recognized him. This was someone he knew personally from being in law enforcement in the area. This guy was Clay Daniels, Molly's supposedly dead husband. He had just clearly dyed his blonde hair black. It would turn out Molly and Clay had staged his death in order to keep him from having to serve that prison sentence for the sexual assault charge, and so they could collect on the $110,000 life insurance policy. The body that was found inside of the burned-out car was obviously not Clay's. It was the body of an 81-year-old woman who Clay had dug up from some isolated cemetery, thrown inside of his vehicle, and then pushed his vehicle off the road and lit on fire with lighter fluid. And so, that was why there was no skid marks up on the road because, again, this was not a car accident. It was staged. And so after Clay and Molly staged Clay's death, it actually worked. People really believed that Clay had died. They were questioning how he died, but nobody really thought it wasn't Clay, and so their plan was working. But after 3 weeks of being apart with Clay kind of hanging out by himself away from the town, Clay and Molly just couldn't stand to be apart any longer. And so Clay dyed his blonde hair black. That was the only thing he did to disguise his identity. And then he just moved back into the home with Molly and the alien kids. And so, that was the new boyfriend that neighbors were seeing Molly with it. She was not actually going out on new dates. She was just back with Clay. And Clay's stepson Caleb, the 4-year-old, he immediately recognized that his father was back even though he had black hair. But Molly and Clay had convinced the little boy that Clay was not really Clay. Instead, this was the new boyfriend, Jake. This is very likely why Caleb had begun acting out. He was old enough to understand that something wasn't right, but not old enough to understand that his parents were lying to him. It's unclear why Molly and Clay, who lived together shamelessly, decided to have this weird rendezvous in the parking lot inside of Clay's Mustang and then go to Taco Bell and eat together. But regardless, it was this secret meetup that ultimately led to them getting caught. Molly and Clay were both charged with insurance fraud and they both pled guilty. Molly was sentenced to 20 years in prison and Clay was sentenced to 30 years in prison plus 20 more years for probation violations. Molly has since been paroled while Clay is still in jail. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved. And some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.